Imagine for a moment the salty sea spray hitting your face as a drakkar cuts through wild waves, the war cry booming in your ears, blood staining the snow. Do you think you've got what it takes? Do you believe your modern spirit, used to comfort and certainty, could survive even one day in a Viking's shoes? History, popular culture, and romantic stories have sold us a picture. Untamed barbarians wearing horned helmets, thirsty for glory and conquest. But here's the truth, that's just a postcard, a sugar-coated fantasy. The reality, my friends, was a totally different beast. Hungry, relentless, one that would chew you up and spit you out in hours. Forget lavish feasts and heroic tales for a moment. Today, we're going to break down that idealized image. We're diving into the brutal, unforgiving truth about what life was really like in the Viking Age. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why your modern life would crumble before the sun sets. From the constant threat of death to no hygiene to harshest laws and the toughest diet, nothing you know could prepare you for this Norse nightmare. We're talking about a time roughly from the late 7th century to the mid-10th century, a period of massive exploration, fierce raids, and a life so brutal it defies what we think is survivable. From the icy lands now called Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, these people spread across Europe, leaving a lasting mark of terror and change. But who were they really? And more importantly, what did it take not just to survive, but to thrive in such a harsh world? Get ready, because the truth isn't distant or glorious, it's raw, and I promise you won't like it. Before you get settled, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always cool to see who's joining us from around the globe. I'm Nighttime Scribe, and my goal is to give you a unique experience as you drift off to sleep. Now, let's pause on any Viking's first tough opponent, their home, their land. Forget the pretty postcards of fjords and the northern lights. Scandinavia's winter wasn't just inconvenient, it was a sentence, a harsh punishment testing every fiber of your being for months on end. We're talking about winters where temperatures didn't just drop below zero, they plummeted so low that the air turned into sharp crystals cutting your skin. Snow piled up in endless layers and ice covered everything, turning every step into a deadly trap and every food hunt into an epic journey. To grasp this challenge, think about the total lack of modern comforts. No thermostats, no central heat, no insulated walls. The only warmth in the longhouses, communal buildings where families often lived with their animals, came from an open fire in the center. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof, but most of it hung inside, creating a thick, harsh atmosphere full of soot. Not healthy, but the only shield against the cold gnawing at your bones. People slept in shared beds, often piled with animal skins. On the harshest nights, even the farm animals were brought inside, so their body heat could help keep things barely bearable. This close living wasn't by choice, it was survival. Hygiene as we know it was a luxury nobody could afford. The main goal was simply not to die. If cold was a constant enemy, food scarcity was its worst partner. The ground froze, crops failed, and homesteads turned into fortresses of hardship. A Viking's winter diet came down to what had been preserved from the warmer months, mostly salted, smoked, or dried meat, like whale, seal, reindeer, or elk, dried fish like cod, and stored grains made into porridge or hard bread. If luck was with them, they might get some fermented or pickled vegetables. Starvation wasn't just an idea, it was a real threat, haunting every family, especially the sick or those with bad harvests. A Viking ship's worth wasn't just about fighting or trading, but also about carrying supplies and reaching new lands full of resources. Every calorie mattered. Every bite was a hard-won win. Yet the cruelest enemy of the Viking winter wasn't hunger but hypothermia. A slip on ice, an oar soaked in a storm, wet clothes that wouldn't dry, your body would start losing heat fast. Think about fingers and toes. Frostbite gangrene was common, a mark of barely surviving. Basic amputations done without anesthesia or antiseptics were the only way to stop the rot. Death by exposure was as common as sunrise, a daily part of life in those wild lands. So next time you complain about a cold breeze or needing a sweater, imagine that silent, ruthless fight, a daily struggle to hold on to every ounce of warmth in a world designed to freeze you solid. That, my friends, was just the start of the Viking experience. If winter was a test of icy endurance, summer, though short and less harsh, was no vacation. It was a race against time, a period where the clan's survival for the coming months was on the line. Vikings couldn't afford to be lazy. Every good weather day was a golden chance to get things done. The days were long, yes, with endless daylight, but the farming window was short. They didn't farm huge fields like in other parts of Europe. The rocky soil and climate made that impossible. They planted tough crops like barley, oats, and rye, key for making bread and beer, a staple drink in their diet and culture. But planting was just step one. From plowing with simple tools pulled by oxen to sowing, tending, and harvesting, it was all backbreaking work. No machines, no chemicals, no pesticides, just pure sweat and muscle. Summer was also for gathering berries, herbs, and mushrooms to dry or store for winter. Fixing the homestead and fishing picked up speed too. It was all about building reserves of fresh meat and fish to smoke or salt, essential to survive the winter. Picture the day, waking with the sun, working non-stop in the fields or on fishing boats, coming home at dusk exhausted, only to prepare tools for the next day. Every family member, from little kids to the elderly, had a job, a role in that survival machine. There was no room for doing your own thing. The whole community relied on everyone pulling together. Even the famous Viking raids and trading trips usually happened in summer. The seas were easier to navigate and the longer days meant bigger adventures. But even these journeys, though sometimes successful, were full of huge risks, sudden storms, shipwrecks, brutal fights, and the chance of never coming back. So while summer gave a break from deadly cold, it offered no rest. It was a season of hard work, a race against time to gather enough resources to survive the coming winter. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a daily win earned through planning, relentless effort, and tough physical and mental endurance. Good times were brief. Danger was constant. Beyond the harsh cold and back-breaking work was a quiet, ongoing enemy attacking the Vikings' minds, the weird light cycles of the far north. If you think only the body suffered back then, think again. Human psychology, so sensitive to the environment, faced what we now call seasonal affective disorder, though back then it was just the brutal reality of life. Imagine a Scandinavian winter, days so short that dusk barely arrives before darkness takes over. For weeks or even months, the sun barely rises above the horizon, and the world stays in a constant dim twilight. The light is gray, faint, almost ghost-like. This lack of sunlight hits brain chemistry hard. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter linked to mood and happiness, drops sharply, while melatonin, the hormone that makes you sleepy, increases, causing fatigue and sluggishness. The result? Deep exhaustion, irritability, low energy, trouble focusing, and in many cases, severe seasonal depression. Imagine being stuck inside dark, smoke-filled houses with little food and the constant threat of cold and sickness. No sunlight only made the despair worse. Hope faded with every day the sun stayed hidden. There were no light therapy lamps or antidepressants, just stoic endurance and the company of others to fight off hopelessness. The Viking sagas and Eddas, though full of heroes, also reflect this sadness and acceptance of a harsh life. But summer wasn't a cure-all for the mind either. If winter was almost endless night, summer brought nearly non-stop daylight. In the far north, the sun barely set or was below the horizon, only a few hours before rising again. While good for farming and sailing, this messed up sleep cycles, causing insomnia, anxiety, and irritability. Our bodies are built for regular light and dark cycles, and when these are thrown off for long periods, it can be just as tough as not enough light. For Vikings, this extreme shift in daylight was constant, part of an environment they couldn't understand or fight scientifically. They fought a silent mental battle alongside their physical struggles. Mental toughness was as important as muscle, a needed adaptation to a world that constantly reminded them how small they were against nature's power. And honestly, today, with our daylight lamps and vitamins, we wouldn't last a day facing that non-stop attack on our mental health. Now, let's talk about another survival cornerstone we take for granted: food. For a Viking, every bite was earned through struggle, careful planning, and often unpredictable luck. Forget supermarkets, endless choices, and always having what you want. The Viking diet was simple, practical, and totally depended on what nature and hard work provided. Their staples were grains, mostly barley and rye. These tough crops grew in the short Nordic summer, cultivated with huge effort. They were ground into flour for making often hard, dense bread or porridge, the base of many meals. Beer, also made from grains, was more than a drink. It was an important source of calories and nutrients, and safer to drink than often contaminated water. If the clan had livestock, cows, sheep, goats, dairy was a key part: milk, whey, cheese, and butter. All high in energy and protein, these were processed and stored. But keeping animals through winter was a huge challenge, because fodder and shelter were scarce. So part of the herd was usually slaughtered in autumn to provide meat for winter, preserved by salting or smoking. Meat was a treat, not everyday food. It came from reindeer, elk, boar, birds, and fishing: cod, herring, salmon. Fishing, especially near coasts and fjords, was a more reliable protein source. Fish was air-dried, making a lightweight, durable food perfect for long trips or winter stores. Farm meat, pork, and mutton was eaten sparingly, since each animal was an investment and source of wool or milk. There was no balanced diet like today. Fresh fruits and veggies were seasonal and rare, limited to summer gathering. Berries, roots, herbs. Vitamin C deficiency was common, leading to diseases like scurvy, especially in long winters. Cooking was basic. They used iron pots over fires, roasted meat, and fermented or dried food for storage. Eating was about survival, not taste. Every meal was proof they had cheated hunger and cold for another day. For someone used to plenty and variety, this boring, often lacking diet would be a harsh shock. No deliveries, no fast food, just the harsh reality of what could be found and kept. And that, my friends, was a constant battle. Without refrigerators or freezers, surviving long Viking winters wasn't just about getting food, it was about preserving it. Their preservation methods were simple but effective. An impressive feat for the time, though not without deadly risks. Vikings mastered smoking, salting, and drying, ways to extend the life of their precious food. Smoking was a careful process. Meat and fish hung over slow fires, soaking in smoke. This gave food a special flavor, and smoke also had antibacterial properties that slowed spoilage. Think of Viking longhouses with their central fires. These homes didn't just give heat, they worked like giant smokehouses. Meat, whether from livestock, wild game, or even whale, and fish were smoked for days or weeks. Salting was another key method. Salt, a precious resource, was rubbed onto meat and fish. or used in salty water baths. Salt pulls moisture out of tissues, creating an environment hostile to bacteria and stopping spoilage. That's why salted fish, like cod, was a crucial trade item and a staple on long sea voyages. Finally, drying was the simplest and most widespread method, especially in places with cold winters and dry winds. Fish, especially cod, were hung outside on wooden racks where the wind and cold would dry them out. The result was a lightweight, compact, and super durable food, perfect for storage or for taking on ships. Meat was sliced thin and air-dried in the same way. But despite these smart methods, foodborne illness was a constant, terrifying risk. They didn't know about bacteria or germs. A mistake in smoking, not enough salting, or unexpected humidity during drying could ruin the food. This led to outbreaks of stomach illnesses, bacterial infections, and in severe cases, botulism, a deadly toxin that could wipe out whole families in hours. Diarrhea, vomiting, and fever were common, and without modern medicine or even basic hygiene, these illnesses often proved fatal, especially for kids and the elderly. Viking life wasn't just a fight against the climate or enemies on the battlefield. It was a daily, silent battle against decay, where one small mistake in preserving food could mean the difference between living another day or suffering a slow, painful death. Food security for them was literally life or death, and if the weather and preservation struggles weren't enough, famine was a constant shadow hanging over Viking life, a recurring, devastating threat that wiped out entire communities. It wasn't an exception. It was part of their reality. Extreme thinness wasn't a sign of illness. It was the norm, a physiological fact of chronic food insecurity. Picture it. They relied almost entirely on seasonal harvests, hunting, fishing, and storing enough to last months without fresh production. A bad summer, unexpected drought, plague, or a particularly harsh, long winter could trigger disaster, and when food ran out, the consequences were brutal. There were no social safety nets or big aid organizations. Each clan, each family depended on their own smarts and luck. Famines killed people directly by starvation and indirectly by weakening immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to disease. A simple flu, a minor infection, or even a cold could become a death sentence for bodies already stretched to the limit. Kids and elderly were the first to go, their fragile bodies unable to handle the lack of calories. Imagine the despair of watching loved ones slowly waste away with nothing to be done. Thinness, beyond being just an appearance issue, was a physiological reality in the Viking Age. A big, bulky body, seen as healthy in other cultures, was rare among the general population. Those who showed real physical strength, the warriors, got it from a meager diet and constant hard work, not from extra calories. They were muscles and tendons built by necessity, not abundance, designed for endurance and agility in battle. Viking raids were partly a response to this scarcity. They weren't just after gold or silver, they also wanted food, livestock, and slaves to work the land. Violence was often an extension of the fight to survive, a desperate way to get resources their land and climate often couldn't provide. For us living in a world where food is everywhere and tons get thrown away daily, the idea of famine as a constant threat is almost impossible to imagine. But for Vikings, it was a harsh reality, a daily lesson in humility, and a test of how fragile life is. Just one winter or summer under those conditions, with an empty stomach and uncertainty in your heart, would have made most of us give up within days. Beyond outright hunger, the Viking diet, though enough to survive, was seriously lacking in many essential nutrients. It wasn't just about eating enough, but about eating the right stuff, something that was a genetic and environmental lottery for them. Lack of key vitamins and minerals didn't just cause discomfort, it led to crippling and often fatal diseases like scurvy and rickets. Take vitamin C, for example. Fresh fruits and many veggies rich in vitamin C were seasonal and scarce in the cold Nordic winters, when people mainly ate salted or dried meat, dried fish, and stored grains. Vitamin C levels dropped dangerously low, causing scurvy, a terrible disease. Symptoms started with extreme tiredness, irritability, and achy joints. Then gums would swell and bleed badly. Teeth loosened and fell out, wounds wouldn't heal, and old scars reopened. Eventually, internal bleeding and organ failure caused a painful death. Imagine a feared Viking warrior, weakened and toothless because of a simple vitamin deficiency. Another common problem was rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D. This vitamin is essential for calcium absorption and bone health and mainly comes from sunlight and some fatty foods. During Nordic winters with little sunlight and a diet low in fatty fish or fresh dairy, Viking kids were especially vulnerable. Rickets softened and weakened bones, causing deformities like bowed legs or a curved spine and rib cage. A child with rickets not only lived with constant pain, but was also less able to work and contribute to the community, lowering their chances of survival in a society that needed strength and endurance. Besides these well-known diseases, Vikings likely suffered from other deficiencies. Iron deficiency caused anemia, leading to chronic tiredness and weakness. Lack of B vitamins hurt metabolism and nerve function. Each deficiency, even if not deadly right away, weakened overall health, disease resistance, and ability to do the tough physical work Viking life required. In short, nutrition in the Viking Age wasn't just about filling the stomach. It was a silent battle against weakness and disease. The immune systems and strong bones we take for granted today were luxuries to them. Facing just one winter with those nutritional gaps, no supplements, no medicine, would have been a struggle none of us could survive. Now, let's leave the cold and scarcity behind and take a closer look at what a Viking's home was really like. You'll see that their dwelling, far from being a cozy refuge, was a fragile shelter that tested the patience and endurance of its occupants. Forget about privacy, individual rooms, or modern ventilation. Viking communal houses, called longhouses or langhus, were dark, cramped spaces often shared with way more than just family. Picture a long wooden, turf, or stone building with a heavy roof that let in barely any light except through a small smoke hole in the center. Inside, the air was thick with a mix of smells: constant smoke from the hearth, dampness, human sweat, and the unmistakable scent of animals. Yes, that's right. During harsh winters, livestock, cows, sheep, goats, weren't kept outside in a barn. They were brought inside into one end or a side area to protect them from deadly cold and, importantly, to use their body heat to help keep the inside barely livable. Of course, this added to the mix of smells, noise, and inevitable lack of cleanliness. Life in these longhouses was deeply communal and had no privacy. Multiple generations of the same family, and sometimes extended family or groups of workers, lived under one roof. They ate, slept, worked, and fixed tools, all in the same space. There were no doors to close for a moment alone, no quiet corners for reflection. If someone got sick, the whole house was exposed. If there were fights, everyone heard and saw it. This constant togetherness, though necessary for survival and support, would have caused serious mental strain for anyone used to personal space. Poor hygiene was a direct result of this lifestyle. Floors, often packed earth or wooden planks, became dumping grounds for food scraps, dirt tracked in from outside, and animal droppings. The ever-present smoke, while keeping bugs away, also irritated lungs and eyes. There were no sanitation systems. Human waste was dealt with outside, but with animals nearby and no running water for regular washing, lice, fleas, and other pests were constant companions. Disease spread easily in such a cramped, poorly ventilated space. For those of us who value personal space, cleanliness, and fresh air, living in a Viking longhouse would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. The lack of privacy and constant exposure to dirty conditions would have been devastating to both physical and mental health. The Viking home wasn't a place of comfort or relaxation. It was a functional shelter barely holding back a merciless world. And its very existence is another reason why you wouldn't last a single day in their leather sandals. Building a house in the Viking Age wasn't just about putting up 4 walls. It was a yearly epic, a massive struggle against nature with simple tools and deep environmental know-how. Forget cranes, power saws, and concrete. A Viking home was a test of endurance and community effort, built from whatever the land offered: wood, turf, and stone. Wood was the main material when available. Trees, often fir or oak, had to be chopped down with iron axes dragged by hand or animals, and then shaped into beams and planks. Imagine the time and energy it took to fell a single big tree, strip its branches, and cut it to size without power tools. Walls were usually made from logs or vertical planks, joined with simple but solid carpentry techniques, often without many iron nails. The quality of the wood and the builder's skill were key to how sturdy the house was. In places where wood was scarce, like Iceland or Greenland, turf was the main building material. Turf, thick layers of decomposed plants, was cut into brick-like blocks. These were stacked to make thick, insulating walls, usually set on stone foundations. Turf provided better insulation than wood, which was crucial in extreme climates. But working with it was hard labor, and it needed constant upkeep since turf walls tended to wear down or settle over time. Stone was mostly used for foundations to keep buildings off wet ground. Sometimes it was also used in turf wall construction or to reinforce wooden walls. But quarrying and shaping stone without advanced tools was tough, so its use was limited. The roof was another big and labor-intensive part. Usually built on a wooden frame, it was covered with layers of sod and earth, giving great insulation and acting like a green roof that protected the wood from weather. Laying those heavy sod layers required massive group effort, but the hard work didn't stop after the house was built. Wood rotted, turf walls crumbled, roofs needed constant repair. Every year, part of the community or family had to put in time and energy to make sure their shelter could survive the next winter. There were no contractors or prefab materials. It was tough, ongoing work, where every beam and turf block showed resilience and teamwork. For someone used to just calling a contractor or buying stuff at the hardware store, building and keeping up one of these homes would be an overwhelming challenge, one you definitely wouldn't last a day doing. For Vikings, fire wasn't just heat and light. It was a constant danger, a red terror that could destroy their precious home in minutes. Given how their houses were built and how they lived, fires in longhouses were an ever-present, devastating risk. Imagine this: an open fire burning day and night in the center of a wooden and turf house. Sparks flying, smoke filling the air. Life went on around the fire. They cooked, fixed tools, wove cloth. But there were no chimneys, modern vents, smoke detectors, or fire extinguishers. The hole in the roof meant to let out smoke wasn't always enough to stop soot and sparks from collecting under the thatch or turf roof. The risk was even higher because flammable materials were everywhere. Dry wooden walls, thatched or turf roofs, animal skins used as bedding or insulation, piles of dung for the animals, and wood piles for fuel, all dangerously close to the open flame. One careless moment, a flying ember, a gust of wind through the smoke hole, or a cooking accident could spark a blazing fire in seconds. When a fire broke out in a communal house, the consequences were devastating. Not only was the shelter lost, but also all possessions, tools, weapons, clothing, and most precious of all, the food stores carefully gathered and preserved for winter. Losing the house meant being exposed to the elements, facing starvation and cold with even fewer resources. In a settlement packed with people and animals, evacuations were chaotic, and the risk of serious burns or death from smoke inhalation was very high. A fire could spread quickly from one house to another, especially since they were often close together. Rebuilding a home destroyed by fire took massive effort and caused a huge disruption to daily life, draining resources and time critical for survival. So while we sleep safely today in fire-resistant homes protected by safety systems, Vikings lived with the constant threat of fire lurking in every spark. This invisible danger, the chance of losing everything in an instant, was just another source of stress and vulnerability in an already harsh life. If the fight for food and warmth was relentless, the battle against disease was invisible, but just as deadly. Hygiene and health as we understand them today were foreign concepts, and the lack of basic sanitation turned every settlement into a breeding ground for countless illnesses. For those of us raised with clean drinking water and sewage systems, this would have been a brutal shock. The reality was that there was no sewer system like ours. Human and animal waste simply piled up outside or was tossed into pits near homes. Imagine the constant stench in a Viking village, especially in warmer months. Rain and melting snow would wash this waste into nearby streams, rivers, and lakes, which were also used for drinking, cooking, and washing. This constant contamination meant swallowing germs was almost unavoidable. Diarrhea and dysentery, caused by bacteria and parasites in dirty water and food, were widespread. Conditions we treat easily today were often fatal then, especially for kids and the elderly, as they cause severe dehydration and extreme weakness. Without antibiotics or rehydration solutions, survival depended on individual toughness. Beyond dirty water, the Vikings didn't understand how diseases spread, so flies, rodents, and other pests moved freely between waste and food. Keeping animals inside also helped spread diseases passed from animals to humans. Personal hygiene was very basic. While there's evidence Vikings cared about their appearance and sometimes bathed in natural water or simple saunas called bat stew, the lack of antiseptic soap, reusing dirty water, and no routine hand washing after using the bathroom or before eating made infections spread easily. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant nuisances. In such conditions, even a small cut could turn into a serious, deadly infection due to poor hygiene and lack of treatment. Life expectancy was low, and many deaths, especially among children, were directly linked to unsafe sanitary conditions. If poor sanitation was the breeding ground, infectious diseases were the ruthless killers in the Viking Age. Without microscopes, vaccines, or antibiotics, every village was a powder keg, and every social gathering a chance to catch something deadly. Epidemics were not just common, they were grim events that wiped out whole communities without mercy. Take dysentery, for example. It wasn't just an upset stomach, it was a severe intestinal infection causing painful, often bloody diarrhea, high fever, and extreme dehydration. In places where water was contaminated with waste, dysentery was everywhere. Imagine a family stuck inside their longhouse during winter, each member falling ill one after another, with uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, draining their bodies and no way to rehydrate or purify water. Death from dehydration was almost certain, especially for the youngest and weakest. Viking expeditions brought new goods but also new germs, bringing home not just treasure but foreign diseases that devastated those without immunity. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas, was another brutal threat. In filthy conditions and poor hygiene, lice were everywhere. Typhus caused high fever, severe headaches, rash, and delirium. Malnourished and cold-weakened bodies were easy targets. Picture a warrior returning from a raid carrying not gold, but lice-infested fleas from a distant port. Within weeks, an outbreak would sweep through the village, people dropping sick everywhere. No one understood why, only that it was divine punishment. The sagas mention mysterious plagues that were probably typhus or dysentery, smallpox, a viral disease with a high death rate and leaving survivors permanently scarred, also caused havoc. Evidence shows it existed in Europe long before and during the Viking Age. Imagine a smallpox outbreak in an isolated village. Without vaccines or treatments, it would spread unchecked, killing many and leaving survivors blind or scarred. Although Vikings traveled far, they were vulnerable to diseases they encountered on raids or brought back, causing repeated outbreaks and population decline. Tuberculosis, a lung disease caused by bacteria, was a slow but steady killer. It spread through the air in smoky, cramped longhouses. Symptoms like chronic cough, low fever, fatigue, and weight loss were often mistaken for malnutrition or simple tiredness. A Viking could suffer from tuberculosis for years before dying, unknowingly infecting everyone around him. And of course, the common cold and other viral infections were far more dangerous back then. Without antivirals or any understanding of respiratory hygiene, a simple cold could turn into fatal pneumonia in a weakened body. Throat infections, ear infections, and untreated wounds could escalate into deadly sepsis. Uncontrolled epidemics didn't just cause deaths, they also wiped out essential workers needed for planting, harvesting, daily chores, and defense. A plague could destroy a community's ability to feed or protect itself, leaving it vulnerable to starvation or attack. Medicine was primitive. Herbs, superstition, and at best rough surgeries without anesthesia or antiseptics. People believed curses or divine wrath explained these tragedies. For us today, with antibiotics, vaccines, and public health systems, life in the Viking Age was a constant gamble with deadly germs. The resilience needed was not just physical, but almost spiritual, accepting disease and death as constant companions. No, we wouldn't last a single day in that world. Our modern immune systems, bodies and minds aren't built to handle that kind of silent terror. Finally, if against all odds a Viking managed to survive the harsh challenges of climate, famine, and epidemics, he still had to face the medicine of his time, where there were no sterile hospitals or doctors with stethoscopes. Viking medicine was a mix of herbal knowledge, deep-rooted superstitions, and basic, painful surgeries that to us would seem like torture. The core of their remedies was herbal lore. Vikings, through generations of trial and error, discovered the properties of countless plants. Did you know that willow bark could relieve pain and fever, the natural predecessor to aspirin? Certain herbs could stop bleeding or help wounds heal, while others had sedative or purgative effects. This knowledge was passed down orally and mainly held by healers, shamans, curanderos, or elder women who served as the community's primary caregivers. But this knowledge was limited and often ineffective against serious illnesses. Alongside herbs, superstitions played an equally important, if not bigger, role. Diseases were often blamed on angry gods, evil spirits, curses, or black magic. Amulets, rituals, offerings to gods like Odin or Thor, and reciting poems and spells were just as common as applying poultices. It was believed that fate, the weird, held unavoidable power over health and sickness. If a warrior came back with a wound that wouldn't heal, not only would an herbal paste be applied, but sacrifices would also be made. They'd ask the gods for help and look for spiritual causes, maybe a magical enemy or a broken taboo. Surgery was the worst part of Viking medicine. In a society where battle wounds were common, amputations, setting broken bones, and pulling out arrowheads were necessary, but all done without anesthesia. Beyond some numbing herbs and with no concept of cleanliness, a blacksmith or experienced fighter might perform the surgery. Broken arms were splinted with wood. Deep wounds were sewn up with needles and thread, made from animal tendons or linen. The pain was unbearable, and the risk of deadly infection was huge. Without antibiotics, sepsis was almost always fatal. Imagine being a wounded warrior with an arrow stuck in you, knowing they'd pull it out while you were fully awake, using crude tools, and that the biggest danger wasn't the arrow but the infection afterward. Even basic care like childbirth was risky. Both mothers and babies faced extremely high mortality rates due to poor hygiene and little understanding of complications. Dentistry was almost non-existent, and dental infections could spread and cause serious problems. Life for adults in the Viking Age was a brutal struggle. Childhood was an even crueler lottery, with shockingly low chances of reaching adulthood by our standards. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, making losing a child a common tragedy, and overall life expectancy barely more than a blink of an eye. For us today, it's hard to imagine that 1 in 2, or even 1 in 3 children wouldn't live past their 5th birthday. Yet that was Viking reality. Newborns were especially vulnerable. Childbirth itself, without modern medical help or basic hygiene, was extremely dangerous for both mother and baby. Infections after birth, heavy bleeding, or delivery complications could all be fatal. Once born, babies faced constant threats. Infectious diseases like dysentery, smallpox, or respiratory infections, which we can treat today, were deadly for weak immune systems. Poor sanitation, dirty water, and living closely with animals and people in longhouses made children easy targets for disease. A simple cold could turn into deadly pneumonia. Malnutrition also took its toll. Babies depended mostly on breast milk, but if the mother was sick or malnourished, the quality and amount of milk suffered. Introducing solid foods often prepared in unsanitary conditions or lacking important nutrients was another critical hurdle. Vitamin deficiencies like rickets caused by lack of vitamin D left many children with bone deformities and weak health. Plus, the home was full of dangers. Open fires, sharp tools, and constant movement of people and animals created a risky environment for little ones, with none of the safety measures we have today. This staggering infant mortality meant overall life expectancy was incredibly low. Estimates suggest the average age at death was between 30 and 40 years, but this number is heavily skewed by the many children who didn't survive. Those who made it through childhood and adolescence had a much better chance of living to 50 or 60, though they were still a minority. Old age, as we think of it today, with decades of retirement and relative good health, was rare and a privilege for the few. The popular image of Vikings as fierce raiders or daring explorers is only one side of their story. The harsh reality is that most Vikings, the backbone of their society, were tied to the land, working exhausting farm labor from dawn until dusk. There was no escaping this relentless work, and the community's survival depended on it. In the Nordic regions, the farming season was brutally short. Summer brought light and warmer weather, but was a frantic race against time. Fields, often small and broken up by rocky hills, had to be prepared quickly. There were no tractors or steel plows. Heavy wooden plows were pulled by oxen or sometimes by several men. The hard, rocky ground yielded inch by inch under this strain. Imagine the sweat, the muscle aches, the constant strain on your back and shoulders, day after day under a sun that barely dips below the horizon. Once the soil was ready, it was time to sow. Barley, rye, and oats were the main crops, since they were tough enough to survive the climate and provided the essential calories people needed. Sowing was done by hand, scattering seeds along the furrows, a process that required patience and precision to get the most out of every bit of farmable land. These weren't huge monoculture fields, but smaller, diverse plots that might include some legumes or hardy vegetables if the soil allowed. But the work didn't stop there. As the crops grew, they needed protection from pests, weeds, and wild animals. There were no pesticides or electric fences. Pest control meant constant hands-on vigilance. Then came harvest time, the peak of the farming season and the busiest period. The grain was cut by hand using simple iron sickles. Every stalk and grain mattered. Once cut, the sheaves had to be tied into bundles and carried, often on the shoulders, to storage areas. Then came threshing, separating the grain from the straw by beating the bundles or trampling them with feet. This exhausting, repetitive work kicked up dust that irritated the lungs. Back-breaking manual labor without machines was the norm. Every tool, the plow, axe, rake, was an extension of the farmer's own strength. Injuries were common, hernias from lifting heavy loads, cuts and blisters from handling tools, chronic joint pain from endless repetitive motions. A Viking farmer's life was non-stop physical effort, a struggle to produce enough for his family and maybe a small surplus for trade or taxes. Their survival depended entirely on nature. A cold or wet summer could mean a bad harvest and bring famine in the winter. Adventure and glory were for the few. The real Viking epic was the day-to-day battle in the fields. Besides crops, livestock was the other key part of their economy and survival. Animal care was constant and demanding, providing food and raw materials year-round. Vikings raised mainly cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, each serving a specific purpose. Cattle gave milk, meat, and pulled the plow. Sheep provided wool for clothing and meat. Goats were hardy and gave milk and meat, even on rough terrain. Pigs were an efficient source of meat and fat, often allowed to forage in the woods. Taking care of animals required constant attention. In the warmer months, animals grazed on communal pastures guarded against predators like wolves or bears. Kids and teens often helped keep them from wandering off. At dusk, the herds were brought back to shelter. Milking cows and goats was a daily chore, vital for making milk into longer-lasting products like cheese, butter, and whey, staples especially in winter. Making these products was labor-intensive and needed skill. But the real challenge came with winter. Without modern barns or stored feed, livestock had to be sheltered indoors, often inside the longhouses. This required careful planning. Storing enough hay and forage through summer and fall to last the winter was always a struggle. Limiting herd sizes. A harsh winter with heavy snow could wipe out a flock from starvation or exposure. Choosing which animals to slaughter in fall for winter meat and which to keep for breeding or milk was a critical decision that could determine survival. Cleaning makeshift stalls inside the home was another constant, unpleasant chore. Animal waste, though useful as fertilizer, had to be regularly removed to keep basic sanitation, which was a constant challenge. In short, Viking animal husbandry wasn't a hobby, but an essential part of survival. It demanded tireless work, deep knowledge of animals, environmental awareness, and careful planning to keep these life-supporting resources through nature's challenges. For someone today who can grab animal products at any supermarket, the daily responsibility of managing a herd like this would be overwhelming. Beyond farming and animal care, Vikings also supplemented their food through fishing and big game hunting, both essential but dangerous and demanding activities. These weren't hobbies but harsh necessities requiring skill, patience, and luck. Fishing was a more reliable food source than hunting, especially along coasts, fjords, and rivers. Vikings were expert seafarers, and that skill extended to fishing. They used handmade nets, lines with bone or metal hooks, and even harpoons. Cod and herring were prized, both for fresh eating and for drying and salting to preserve. But fishing in the North Sea or icy fjords was no leisure activity. They faced sudden storms, huge waves, and freezing temperatures in small, open boats. A capsized boat, tangled nets, or a sudden storm could mean death by hypothermia within minutes. Fishermen spent long hours, sometimes days, in harsh conditions, coming home with numb hands and feet, but the hope of enough food. Big game hunting was even riskier and less predictable. The Scandinavian forests were full of wildlife, from small rodents and birds to large, dangerous animals like reindeer, elk, wild boar, and bears. Hunting big game was a group effort, often using traps, nets, and drives to corner the animals. A run-in with an angry elk or a bear could be deadly. Weapons, bows, arrows, spears, axes required accuracy and strength. There were no scopes or high-powered rifles. Every arrow had to hit its mark. Every spear had to count. Besides meat, hunting provided essential materials. Hides were turned into clothes, shoes, bedding, and house covers to protect against the cold. Bones and antlers became tools, combs, needles, and decorations. Tendons were used as rope or thread. Nothing was wasted. The Viking hunter needed deep knowledge of the land, animal behavior, and tracking. Hours waiting in the cold, exhausting chases through snow or forest, constant risk of injury or attack, all the price of survival. And when food was scarce and winter was harsh, necessity pushed hunters into even greater dangers. For a modern person used to supermarkets or weekend hunting trips, the intensity and risks of Viking fishing and hunting would be overwhelming. There was no guarantee of success, and failure didn't just mean a missed meal, but the real threat of starvation. In Viking society, there were no factories or mass production. Every object, from a simple wooden spoon to a deadly sword, was crafted with skill and care. Hands were the primary tools, and the knowledge passed down through generations was the true treasure. Daily life was full of manual labor. Every item was literally handmade. Blacksmithing was one of the most vital and respected trades. Iron, a precious resource, was pulled from basic mines or peat bogs. The smith was the community's technological core. In his forge, fueled by hand-operated bellows, he turned metal into farming tools like axes and plows, weapons like axes and swords, shields, nails, and rivets for ships, and cooking utensils. Each hammer strike on the anvil was an act of creation, requiring strength, precision, and deep knowledge of metal. Viking swords, for instance, were not just weapons but works of art, often made with complex techniques like pattern welding or damascening for extra strength and sharpness. Being a smith wasn't just a job, it was a position of power and respect, since the community's ability to work, trade, marry, and defend itself depended on him. Carpentry was just as essential. Wood was everywhere, in houses, ships, furniture, utensils. Viking carpenters, masters of axe and chisel, built everything from detailed decorative pieces to the framework of longhouses and sturdy barrels for storing food and drink. The art of Viking shipbuilding, which allowed them to travel oceans and rivers, is a stunning example of their carpentry skills, using complex joinery with almost no nails. Every plank and beam was cut, planed, and fitted with a precision that today would require advanced machinery. Weaving and making clothes were mostly women's work. Sheep's wool was hand-spun on distaffs and then woven on vertical looms. This was incredibly labor-intensive. A single cloak or tunic could take weeks or even months. Clothes weren't just for warmth but also showed social status through colors and patterns. Turning hides into leather for shoes, shields, and straps was another important skill, involving soaking, scraping, and tanning, using methods that today would seem crude and unpleasant. Every item in Viking life was valuable because it represented hours of hard work and scarce resources. Nothing was wasted. A broken tool was fixed. A worn garment was mended as much as possible. Self-reliance was the norm, and relying on the community's shared skills was absolute. For us, used to buying anything online with a click, the idea that everything was shaped, forged, or woven by human hands, under tough conditions, would test our patience and abilities beyond limits. Craftsmanship was a matter of survival. In Viking society, there was no concept of leisure like we know it today, and no one was exempt from physical work. The division of labor was clear and crucial. Everyone had to pitch in. Each family and community member had a vital role, with total interdependence. Men usually handled the heavy and dangerous jobs outside the home. Hard farming, plowing, cutting trees, building large structures, big game hunting, deep-sea fishing, and of course warfare and trading raids. Blacksmithing and shipbuilding were mostly men's work. They also took care of defense, battle prep, and weapons training as part of daily life. Women, on the other hand, were the heart of the home and economy, caring for kids despite high infant mortality, preparing and preserving food, drying, salting, smoking, making dairy products, spinning, weaving, sewing, and keeping the household running. Women also helped with animal care, milking, herding smaller livestock, and sometimes helped in lighter farming tasks, especially during harvest. Women could be household heads, called husfreyja, with considerable authority over domestic and economic affairs. Interestingly, Viking women had more rights than many other cultures at the time. They could own land, start divorces, and even manage farms if their husbands were away. And children shouldn't be forgotten. From an early age, childhood wasn't endless playtime. Kids took on age-appropriate jobs, herding animals, gathering firewood, carrying water, helping prepare food, and looking after younger siblings, learning important survival skills. Girls learned spinning, weaving, and food prep. Boys learned tool use, big game hunting, and fighting skills. There was no room for laziness. Every pair of hands was needed. This division of labor wasn't optional but essential. The family and clan depended on every part working smoothly. There was no tolerance for slack or over-specialization, except in highly skilled trades like smithing. Someone used to regular work hours, weekends off, and a clear line between work and personal time would be overwhelmed by the non-stop demands and lack of breaks in Viking life. Rest was almost an unknown luxury, contrary to the simple idea of a society ruled only by male warriors. Women played a crucial role, a true backbone supporting social and economic life. Far from being passive, Viking women were managers and producers, holding the home and community together. Managing the household was their domain, symbolized most clearly by their keys, not just one key but a whole bunch, usually hung at their waist, representing control over storage chests, pantries, and basically the household's wealth and supplies. The husfreyja, or lady of the house, was the chief manager, the strategist behind daily survival. Her duties covered a wide and complex range. First was managing household resources. This wasn't about big money, but careful resource management. She decided how food was stored, how much was used, what could be sold in the local market, and what had to be saved for lean times. Making sure the family had enough food, firewood, and essentials to survive the winter was her responsibility. How well she planned could mean the difference between survival and disaster for the whole clan. The education of the children was largely her responsibility. She not only took care of their physical needs, but also passed on practical knowledge and cultural values. girls learned from their mothers essential household skills, like spinning, weaving, cooking, preserving food, and treating wounds with herbs. Boys, though they would eventually join men in farming or warfare, spent their early years learning from their mothers the basics of community life and the sagas that shaped their identity. Taking care of livestock was another key task. While men might tend herds out in distant fields, women handled the daily milking of cows and goats and made dairy products like cheese and butter. This was ongoing, vital work, since dairy was an important source of protein and fat. The health of the animals, especially during the harsh winters when they stayed indoors, was a daily concern for the husfreyja. In addition, Viking women were deeply involved in textile production, from shearing wool to dyeing, spinning, and weaving the family's clothes. This was a demanding, non-stop craft. They also managed food preparation, which included much more than just cooking. It covered the whole preservation process, from salting fish to smoking meat. Women's authority in the home was legally recognized. They could own land, inherit property, and sometimes even divorce their husbands, giving them more independence than women in many other European cultures at the time. When men left on long trips, women took full charge of the farm and all its affairs, showing strong leadership and management skills. For someone today used to specialized jobs and easy access to services and products, the non-stop, wide-ranging workload of a Viking woman would be overwhelming. Her day never really ended. It was a continuous flow of tasks essential to her family's survival. Her resilience and management skills were just as heroic as any warrior's feats on the battlefield. Beyond running the household, Viking women were active in farming and crafting work that kept daily life going. Their labor, often overlooked in epic stories, was just as crucial as that of warriors or farmers, and without it, Viking society wouldn't have functioned. In farming, men did the heavy work like plowing, but women took part in almost every other step. From sowing seeds, a delicate job requiring patience, to weeding and harvesting smaller crops. During harvest, women and children worked alongside men, cutting grain, binding sheaves, and carrying them home. Their knowledge of edible wild plants, fences, and medicinal herbs was key for supplementing diets and treating illnesses. But where women's work really stood out was in textile production, a constant, demanding job that clothed the whole family. This started with spinning wool or flax. Women spent countless hours at the distaff and spindle, turning coarse fibers into thread. Imagine the skill and patience needed to spin enough thread for an entire family's clothing. Then came weaving. Vertical looms, often set up inside the longhouse, turned thread into fabric. Weaving a tunic, cloak, or even a boat's sail could take weeks or months. Each piece was a treasure, made to last and patched again and again. This work was not just practical. It often included detailed patterns and natural dyes, making it both an art form and a sign of social status. Food prep and preservation were another huge responsibility, mainly on women's shoulders. This went beyond daily cooking and included salting and smoking meat and fish for winter, drying fruits and herbs, and making dairy products like cheese and butter, which required special fermentation and storage know-how. Each step was critical to avoid famine and survive the cold months. One mistake could mean sickness or death. For example, processing a whole catch of herring or slaughtering a pig and making sure every part was preserved for months was a complex operation that today would need an industrial plant. Viking women were basically the main providers of warmth, clothing, and lasting food for their households. Their tireless work, often starting before dawn and ending long after dusk, was the foundation that let men farm, trade, or fight wars. The romantic image of rough Viking warriors depends on the hard work of women who spun, wove, and prepared every meal and every garment that kept them alive. While a Viking woman's life mostly centered on home, farming, and crafts, history and archaeology show some exceptional women who broke traditional roles to gain power and influence, often going against the norms of their time. These women were rare but show how complex women's roles could be and how flexible Viking society was in some ways. The idea of the shield maiden, Skjaldmær, is the most famous and intriguing example. In Icelandic sagas like the Saga of Eric the Red or the Saga of Hervor and Heidrek, these women fought alongside men as warriors. Archaeological finds like the Birka burial in Sweden, where a woman was buried with high-status weapons and military gear, may back this up. Though historians debate how common they were, the fact that a woman could fight with an axe and be respected for it shows Viking society was less rigid about gender roles than many other European cultures at the time. It wasn't the norm, but it was possible. Beyond battle, some Viking women held significant political and religious power. Women rulers and landowners existed. Sagas tell of women managing large farms and estates when their husbands were away or after they were widowed, showing leadership well beyond the home. For example, in Iceland, women had property rights and could represent themselves at thing assemblies. Some even led minor clans or influenced major decisions. Another important group were the Völva or seeresses, priestesses and shamans. These women played key religious roles as oracles, healers, and mediators between people and the gods. Their wisdom and spiritual status earned them respect and influence, often shaping decisions made by male leaders and the whole community. Their power was intellectual and spiritual, showing that female influence came in many forms. These exceptional cases don't change the fact that most Viking women faced tough daily labor, but they do show us that Viking society was more complex than we might think. Viking women had legal rights and in some situations could push back against expectations, whether by fighting in battle, managing large estates, or leading their communities spiritually. Their roles of power and relative independence compared to other cultures at the time, show that although the Viking world was harsh, it wasn't one-dimensional when it came to gender roles. Still, for most people, everyday survival was the real challenge. If you're watching this video, I hope you've already subscribed to the channel. I'm Nighttime Scribe, and my goal is to build a big community of people who love the night and love learning. Thousands from all over the world, connected by a shared desire to know more, understand themselves better, and live a better life. I always say it and mean it. Knowing history is key to avoiding past mistakes. So take a moment now to subscribe and share this video with a friend who's a knowledge junkie. And if you're feeling generous, feel free to send me a super thanks. Either way, I'm truly grateful you're sharing this time with me. Now, let's get back to the story. In the Viking Age, childhood wasn't a long time of leisure or play. From a very young age, it was tough preparation for adult life, where every game and lesson was directly tied to survival in a harsh world. Viking kids learned by doing, thrown right into the reality of their lives. Their games weren't just for fun, they were practice for skills they'd need as adults. Boys worked with basic bows, wooden spears, and toy swords to build aim, coordination, and strength, skills vital for home life and battle. They competed in running, wrestling, and throwing stones, building endurance and controlled aggression. These games were basically their gym and combat training. They learned courage and how to handle pain early on, since weakness wasn't tolerated. Girls learned the detailed household skills through play. Their games often imitated their mom's work, caring for simple dolls that stood in for babies or using small toy looms to practice spinning and weaving. They learned to identify and use herbs, keep fires going and care for small animals. They watched and helped with daily chores, soaking up the knowledge they'd need as adults. Learning was practical and started early. There were no formal schools like we have today. Education was a family and community effort. Parents, grandparents, and others passed down skills and knowledge through generations. Boys went with their dads to fish or plow, learning about land and sea. Girls stayed close to their moms or grandmas, learning food preservation and textile work. Beyond practical skills, education passed on Viking culture and values. Sagas and epic poems weren't just stories. They taught history, morals, and the proud legacy of their ancestors. Kids learned about gods, legends, honor, loyalty, and why reputation mattered. Since writing was limited and rare, oral memory was crucial. Childhood in Viking society wasn't a carefree time, but a constant training ground where every day prepared kids for adult challenges. There was no room for weakness or long dependence. Contributing to family and community was expected from early on, so becoming an adult meant taking on more responsibility, not just a status change. For someone today used to formal schools and protected childhoods, this survival-focused upbringing would be a harsh shock. One big difference is that there were no formal schools, no dedicated buildings, no professional teachers, no textbooks, no class schedules. Knowledge wasn't learned in classrooms, but absorbed through living life, passed down orally and by doing. Picture a Viking kid's day. From their first steps, they were around adults doing essential survival tasks. Learning wasn't separate from life, it was life. A toddler might watch his dad plow, his mom spin wool, his grandpa fix a fishing net. They weren't sitting on benches listening to lectures, they were involved. Oral tradition was how knowledge was shared. Sagas, poems, and myths were like living encyclopedias. Through them, kids learned about their ancestors, family laws, heroes' deeds, and dangers in the world. Practical knowledge was passed on too, how to navigate by stars, predict weather, use medicinal herbs, and read runes. Though runes existed, they weren't for mass reading but for special inscriptions. Memory was a vital skill, trained from early on since important information was stored and shared by word of mouth. More importantly, kids learned by doing. They didn't just listen, they acted. By 6 or 7 years old, kids were already helping with family work. Boys learned to use farm tools, sharpen knives, care for small animals, track forest creatures, and build or repair things. Weapon skills started with sticks and stones, then simple bows and axes. They learned to handle small boats and fishing. Every task was a lesson, every mistake a chance to learn, often the hard way. Girls learned the home's many demands, collecting firewood and water, cooking without recipes, preserving food, spinning, weaving, sewing, and caring for babies and the sick. They gained deep knowledge of household management and crafts, the foundation of self-sufficiency. This school of life built a strong connection to the environment and a clear understanding of the cost of failure. There were no exams or diplomas. Survival itself was the proof of learning. For someone today with years of formal schooling and plenty of theory, being thrown into this purely practical, need-driven learning would be a huge cultural and physical adjustment. The lack of formal schools didn't mean no education, but rather a more integrated and brutally effective way to learn for their world. In the Viking world, survival wasn't about luck, but about strength and skill, qualities that didn't come out of nowhere. From a very early age, kids went through constant physical training, a tough preparation that shaped them into resilient, capable individuals in a world where weakness meant death. There were no gyms or personal trainers. The battlefield and the farm were their gyms, and necessity was their strict coach. As soon as they could hold something, boys, and sometimes girls, were introduced to basic weapons. Sticks became practice swords, branches, spears, Toy bows taught them how to aim, a skill essential both at home and in battle. Childhood games weren't just for fun, but were drills for fighting and survival. Fighting, running, climbing, throwing. Every activity was meant to build muscle strength, agility, stamina, and hand-eye coordination. There was no room for laziness. Every muscle had to be ready. Training went beyond handling weapons. Life itself was constant physical exercise. Kids did chores that today would seem exhausting. Hauling heavy firewood for the hearth, carrying water buckets from the well or river, herding animals over rough land, helping plow fields or transport crops. These daily tasks built endurance few people today could match. Their bodies got used to long effort, cold, and hunger. Strength and skill games were also important. Wrestling, stone lifting contests, foot or horseback races, and endurance challenges in tough conditions were common. These not only strengthened their bodies but also built competitiveness, discipline, and pain tolerance, key qualities for warriors and members of their society. Besides that, growing up exposed to harsh weather, a limited diet, and hard physical work made them tough in ways that would surprise us today. They were taught not just to be strong, but to endure pain and hardship without complaining. For someone used to a sedentary life, comfort, and steady nutrition, the physical training of a Viking child would be overwhelming. Muscles aching, stamina failing, and mind worn down by the endless demands of a world with no shortcuts. The making of a Viking started from the cradle, and every day tested their spirit. In Viking society, law and order weren't based on written codes or centralized courts like ours. Instead, they depended on a complex system of customs, precedents, and most importantly, honor, and the constant threat of blood vengeance. The place where this system came alive was in assemblies called things. The things, or thing in Old Norse, were not just meetings but the heart of Viking governance, a crucial space where the community gathered to make decisions, settle disputes, and deliver justice. Picture a large natural clearing, a circle of stones or an open-air spot, where free men, and sometimes notable women, from a district or region met. There were no comfy chairs or microphones. Voices had to carry across hundreds or even thousands under the open sky. Here, an early form of direct democracy was practiced. Important decisions, like making new laws or launching expeditions, were made by consensus or loud agreement, not by secret vote. The law speaker, who recited the laws each year since they weren't written down, played a key role in keeping the community's legal memory alive. But the thing's most important job was settling disputes and administering justice. Without police or formal prisons, conflicts were settled in public. Cases ranged from land or property disputes to offenses against honor, assaults, and murders. The involved parties presented their arguments, often through skilled speakers, and witnesses were called. There was no prosecutor or lawyer like we have today, just representatives of the clans involved. Viking justice wasn't so much about assigning guilt as about securing compensation and keeping social order. If a crime happened, the main goal was to get compensation. The guilty party had to pay the victim or their family. For example, if someone killed another person, the killer's family had to pay an agreed amount of silver or goods to the victim's family. If both sides agreed and compensation was paid, the conflict was settled and blood vengeance avoided. The community at the thing acted as mediator and guarantor of these deals. But if no agreement was reached or someone refused to follow the decision, the punishment could be outlawry, utlager. An outlaw lost all rights and legal protection. Anyone could kill them without consequences. This was the harshest punishment, basically a death sentence, turning the outlaw into a lonely wanderer with no refuge or help. The threat of blood vengeance, feud, was a powerful force in this legal system. If a serious crime like murder went unpaid or justice wasn't satisfied, the victim's family had the right and social duty to seek revenge against the offender or their clan. This could lead to long cycles of violence. As many Icelandic sagas show, the thing was meant to contain and regulate this violence by providing a formal way to resolve conflicts. To someone used to judges, lawyers, prisons, and the presumption of innocence, the Viking legal system would seem chaotic, intimidating, and harshly straightforward. Its reliance on honor, social status, and negotiating openly under the threat of blood vengeance made every dispute a high-stakes game where one mistake could cost a life. Viking justice was not for the faint-hearted. At its core, driven by survival itself, was blood vengeance or blood feud. Far from just an emotion, it was a sacred duty, a key pillar of their legal and social system that often sparked relentless violence lasting generations. There were no jails for murderers and no central state to enforce the law. Justice ultimately rested with family and clan. Imagine this: a family member, your father, brother, or son, has been killed or seriously hurt. In Viking society, if acceptable compensation couldn't be agreed on at the thing, or if the family's honor was too high to be bought with silver, blood feud kicked in. This meant the victim's family had both the right and moral duty to avenge the wrong. It wasn't optional, but a responsibility imposed by the community and ancestral honor. To neglect blood vengeance was not only to dishonor the dead, but to weaken the status and respect of the whole clan. The goal of vengeance wasn't always to kill the offender. It could mean mutilating them, stealing their livestock, burning down their farm, or even killing a member of their family. It was usually the last act that sparked the cycle of violence. If the offended family killed someone from the aggressor's clan, then that family became the offended party with the duty to take revenge, starting a deadly spiral of retaliation that could pull entire clans and their allies into long-lasting conflicts. The famous blood feuds in many Icelandic sagas are classic examples. A typical case appears in the saga of Njál. After a series of slights and murders, a blood feud breaks out involving multiple families, ending in a home being burned and key people killed. Despite efforts to mediate at the things, the desire for revenge was stronger than peace. Clan leaders spent a lot of time managing these tangled loyalties and rivalries, trying to stop uncontrolled vendettas from tearing the region apart. Blood feuds weren't total chaos. They acted as a form of social control in a decentralized society. The threat of revenge worked as a deterrent. Did you know that anything you did against someone could have deadly consequences, not just for you, but for your whole family? Still, it was a system that caused constant instability and required ongoing vigilance. Marriages, oaths, and treaties were made to try to control or divert these feuds. For someone from a modern society where the rule of law bans private violence and justice is handled by fair institutions, living under the weight of blood feud would be a nightmare. Every fight, every disagreement could spiral into terrifying violence. You'd live with the constant fear that your family might be targeted for revenge over a relative's actions, or that you might have to take a life to restore honor. The mental pressure and physical danger built into this idea alone would be enough to make a modern person last not a day in the Viking Age. Honor was everything, and vengeance its relentless shadow. Within the complex Viking system of laws and vendettas existed a formal, extreme way to settle personal disputes. The duel, or holmgang, wasn't a random street fight, but a ritual with rules, often the last option when negotiations or the things failed. It was a fight for honor where people risked their lives to clear their names or get justice. Holmgang was legally recognized, a type of trial by combat. Its main purpose was to settle disputes involving personal honor, from slander and serious offenses to property claims and blood feuds. Holmgang literally means going to a small island or mound, referring to the marked-off area where the fight happened. This special spot made sure the duel followed specific rules and limited outside interference. Rules varied but usually included a space marked with hides or stakes, often about 9 steps wide. Both fighters showed up, sometimes with seconds or sponsors. They could have a limited number of shields and replace them if broken. The weapons, axes, swords, or spears were agreed on beforehand. The goal wasn't always to kill. Sometimes it was to draw first blood or force the other to surrender, though death was a common and accepted result. Imagine this. Bjorn is accused of stealing a horse from Gunnar's farm, or worse, Gunnar has publicly called Bjorn a coward. Words have been exchanged. Bjorn's reputation is at stake, and no fair settlement was reached at the thing. A holmgang is challenged. Both men meet at the agreed spot. The tension is thick, not just because of the fight ahead, but because losing means shame. Their family's honor hangs in the balance. The fight is brutal and unforgiving. It might end with one man dead or seriously wounded and humiliated, his honor ruined and forced to pay heavy compensation. Interestingly, holmgang could originally be a way to settle disputes, without dragging entire clans into blood feuds. But over time, it turned into a tool for bullies or the strongest to extort others, challenging weaker or less skilled men to steal their lands or goods. If the challenged man refused, his honor was destroyed, and he became an outlaw. This abuse led to holmgang being banned in Iceland around 1000 CE and in Norway during the 10th century, replaced by more civilized justice systems, less reliant on brute force. For us today, the idea of a state is so basic, we hardly question it. We expect governments to provide security, justice, and infrastructure. But in the Viking Age, there was no central government, no police, no standing army, no bureaucracy to look after people's welfare. Protection depended entirely on clan, family, and personal reputation. Living without central authority was itself a daily test of survival. Imagine a world without 911. If someone robbed you, attacked your farm, or hurt your family, there was no higher power to turn to. Your only defense and recourse was your blood ties and alliances. Your clan or kindred, a broad group of relatives by blood and marriage, was your army, police, and justice system. The bigger and stronger your clan, the safer you were. Numbers and a reputation for standing together to defend each other were the best deterrents against outside threats. Family, in the broadest sense, was your shield. Everyone, from the fiercest warrior to the oldest woman, played a role in this protection. An attack on one was an attack on all. This built fierce loyalty and unbreakable solidarity, but also meant one person's actions could put the whole group at risk, fueling the cycles of blood feud we've already talked about. Reputation, drengar for men, meaning honor and courage, was another vital form of protection. A man or woman known for being honorable, brave in battle, and loyal to their clan earned respect and usually avoided being an easy target. On the other hand, anyone seen as weak, cowardly, or dishonorable was fair game for abuse, extortion, or losing their land. The sagas are full of stories where losing honor was as devastating as losing life. For us, used to big cities and anonymous laws, the idea that your safety depended directly on what others thought of you, and your ability to defend yourself or be defended by relatives would be a constant psychological burden. The Viking state showed itself in the things, but these were more like forums for discussion and agreement than executive bodies with real power. Their decisions depended on the consent of the strongest clans, and their ability to enforce rulings was limited. If an agreement was broken, justice fell again to those who were wronged. For example, imagine a farmer whose harvest is stolen by a group of outsiders. Today, you'd call the police. In the Viking Age, that farmer would have to gather his relatives. Together they'd decide whether to seek compensation at the thing or to take up arms and get back what was stolen, risking the outbreak of a blood feud. Survival didn't rely on law, but on the combined strength of your family. Without centralized power, Viking life was a constant balancing act of alliances, a non-stop display of strength and total reliance on personal ties. For a modern person used to trusting institutions and laws, this kind of forced independence and constant need for self-defense would be overwhelming and frightening. Security was a very different concept, earned every day with sweat, loyalty, and often blood. To understand why a modern person wouldn't last a day as a Viking, we have to dive into their mindset, a worldview shaped by the harshness of their existence and a unique relationship with the divine. Their religion wasn't just beliefs, but an all-encompassing way of life, influencing every decision, battle, and breath. At its core was the Norse pantheon, a vibrant, dangerous world where gods and goddesses represented the forces of nature and fate. Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death, was a complex and powerful figure, often called on for success in battle and secret knowledge. Thor, protector of humanity with his hammer, embodied raw strength, order, and resilience, called upon to guard homes and harvests. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, but also of war and death, represented life's dual nature and the earth's generosity. Alongside them were lesser gods, nature spirits, and a rich mythology of giants, elves, and dwarfs. The relationship with these deities was active and reciprocal. Vikings didn't expect free favors but gave sacrifices and rituals to earn divine support. These ranged from offerings of food and drink at stone altars to animal sacrifices during major festivals like Yule, the winter solstice, or harvest celebrations. Human sacrifices, though rarer and tied to specific cults or crises, are also mentioned in some sources, highlighting the intensity of their devotion. Ceremonies took place at sacred outdoor sites or wooden temples with idols. The community gathered for these events, strengthening social bonds and shared identity under the gods' watch. Beyond the gods, the Viking worldview was deeply influenced by fate, or wired, not controlled by gods, but a tapestry of past, present, and future woven by the Norns, the equivalents of the fates. This sense of fate didn't lead to passivity. It inspired fierce boldness. If your fate was sealed, why fear death in battle? To die bravely was the path to Valhalla, Odin's hall, a glorious reward. To die from illness or old age was less honorable. This belief gave Vikings a near-reckless courage in battle, ready to face danger head-on. They didn't think in terms of sin like Christianity, but of honor and shame, acts that built or ruined reputation. Life was a cycle of birth, struggle, and death, with Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, as the inevitable end. For a modern person used to control, free will, and a linear view of history, stepping into this worldview would be a huge cultural shock. Accepting fate, brutal sacrifices, the ever-present supernatural, and the lack of a merciful God would feel unbearable. In that world, you wouldn't last a day. Your modern mind couldn't carry the weight of such a destiny. At the heart of the Viking mindset was a concept deeply foreign and maybe frightening to us today. Fate, or wyrd, wasn't an abstract idea but a real force, an inescapable web of events spanning past, present, and future. The world wasn't random or unfair. It was the very fabric of existence woven by the Norns at the foot of Yggdrasil, the world's ash tree. For Vikings, wyrd wasn't a prophecy to avoid, but a reality to face. This created an interesting paradox. If your destiny was already set, if the time and way of your death were fixed, how did that shape choices and fear? The answer, instead of making them passive, Wired often sparked near superhuman boldness and ferocity. If a warrior believed his death in battle was already written, why hesitate when danger came? The fear of death was eased by the belief that no one could escape their destined end. What mattered most was not if you died, but how. To die with honor in battle, sword in hand and courage in heart, guaranteed a place in Odin's Valhalla or in the folk realm of Freya. It was a glorious death, an eternal reward. To die in bed from illness or old age was less honorable, a straw death lacking heroic glory. This mindset let them charge fearlessly against stronger enemies, seeking not always victory but an honorable death when called. It didn't mean Vikings didn't plan or weren't smart. They were brilliant sailors and tacticians, but they accepted that bigger forces were at work. If a raid failed or a harvest was lost, it wasn't always personal failure but part of Wired. This sometimes brought resignation but also resilience. They didn't blame themselves too much. Instead, they prepared for whatever came, knowing even gods faced the final destiny of Ragnarok. For example, a Viking leader might decide to launch a risky raid, not just for wealth, but because a dream or omen, seen as part of Wired, showed it was his path, his destiny tied to that journey. Even if the risk was huge, belief in fate gave him unstoppable determination. The sagas are full of people who, aware of their fate, met it with courage, even if it led to tragedy. Gunnar Diendi from the saga of Ingjal fights to the end knowing he can't escape his destiny, but does so with legendary bravery. In the Viking worldview, life on Earth was just a prelude. What happened to the soul after death was a central concern that shaped how they lived and how they died. The obsession with dying an honorable death in battle to earn a place in Valhalla wasn't some romantic fantasy, but a deep drive that pushed warriors to incredible acts of bravery. Valhalla, the Hall of the Fallen, was the warrior's paradise, the ultimate destination for those who died bravely in combat. It was Odin's great hall in Asgard, a realm of eternal glory where the Einherjar, the fallen warriors, spent their days training for Ragnarok and their nights feasting on mead and boar. The Valkyries, beautiful warrior maidens, were tasked with choosing the worthy dead and guiding them to this glorious fate. Valhalla wasn't a place to rest, but one of ongoing preparation for the final battle, a reflection of Viking life itself. In contrast was Helheim, the realm of the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. This was the fate of most people, those who died from illness, old age, or any other straw death. Helheim wasn't a fiery hell like in Christian beliefs, but a bleak, cold and dull place of mist and darkness where souls simply existed without Valhalla's glory or fellowship. Ending up in Helheim was, to a warrior, a humiliating opposite of everything they valued. This clear divide between Valhalla and Helheim created a powerful motivation. Fear of Helheim and longing for Valhalla fueled courage in battle. Warriors fought not just for loot or fame, but for their eternal destiny. Death in combat wasn't an end, but the start of a glorious existence. This belief gave them a boldness that could freeze their enemies. How do you fight someone who doesn't fear death but welcomes it if it's honorable? Picture a young warrior in the middle of a raid, surrounded by enemies and facing slim chances of survival. Instead of surrendering or running, he charges with renewed fury, knowing that if he falls with his axe in hand, the Valkyries will claim him for Valhalla. His last breath is a war cry, not a cry of pain. This mindset shows up throughout the sagas, where heroes choose a glorious death over a life of shame. For a modern person who sees death as a final end or peaceful afterlife, the Viking obsession with violent death as the path to eternal glory would be unimaginable and terrifying. Our natural fear of pain and danger would clash with their desire for a heroic death. No, in a world where your soul's fate depended on how you died in battle, and where Helheim was always a threat, our modern mindset wouldn't survive a day. Viking life was constant training for a glorious death. In the Viking universe, the line between everyday life and the mystical was blurred, almost non-existent. Magic, especially cedar, wasn't fantasy but a real power, a way to influence destiny and reveal the hidden. Central to this practice were the vulva, mysterious women respected and feared in equal measure. Cider was a shamanistic magic mainly linked to the goddesses Freya and Odin. It involved divination, dream interpretation, casting spells to shape the weather or battle outcomes, and even astral travel to gain insight. Unlike runic magic, which was formal and male-dominated, cider was seen as subtle, emotional, and sometimes viewed as unmanly if men practiced it too openly. The vulva, staff-bearers, or seers, were women of a distinct social role, often traveling from place to place, called upon in crises for their prophetic and magical skills. When a vulva arrived in a settlement, she was given a special place, often a raised platform or high seat, where she performed rituals dressed in distinctive clothing and carrying a ceremonial staff as a symbol of power. Imagine a Viking community facing famine or preparing for an important raid. A clan leader might call a vulva to conduct a cedar ritual, chants, trances, maybe mind-altering substances, to contact spirits or cosmic forces and glimpse the future. Will the harvest be good? Will the raid succeed? Is there betrayal hidden among them? Her mysterious words were taken very seriously, believed to reveal the world's fate. A fascinating story from the saga of Eric the Red tells of Audur Björnardóttir, little vulva, who was invited to a Greenland farm to predict the end of a famine through a detailed satyr ritual. The role of the vulva was complex, deeply respected for their connection to the supernatural and their ability to predict events, advice that could influence military, marriage, or farming decisions, but also feared. Magic could be used for good or evil, to send sendings, spirits sent to harm, or cast harmful spells. Their mysterious powers and control over the unseen made them objects of both reverence and caution. For a modern person grounded in science, the idea of magic as a real force and the vulva as powerful advisors would be a huge cultural shock. The thought that a harvest's success or a battle's outcome could depend on a magical ritual, or that your fate could be revealed by a trance-state woman, would seem irrational and scary. In that world where the supernatural was as real as an axe and the vulva wove invisible threads of destiny, your modern mind wouldn't last a day. When we think of Vikings, violence is the first image that comes to mind. But it's important to understand that their brutality wasn't limited to far-off battlefields. It was part of daily life in ways we can hardly imagine. Violence wasn't a last resort, it was often the first option, and its normalization is one of the biggest cultural shocks. Raids and sackings were the era's hallmark acts of violence, calculated and ruthless. The longships, those impressive war vessels, carried not just warriors but the promise of death, slavery, and destruction. When Vikings landed, they took whatever they wanted by force. Settlements, monasteries, farms, all were targets. Resistance meant death. Men were killed, women and children often enslaved. Slavery, thraldom, was a foundation of the Viking economy. Captives taken in raids were brought back to Scandinavia, Iceland, or Greenland to work on farms, serve households, or be sold in slave markets. Their lives were ones of servitude with no rights or hope. Imagine your home burning, loved ones slaughtered, and yourself dragged away in chains to a foreign land and a lifetime of servitude. Terror was real. Destruction was strategic. Burning farms or villages not only took resources but sent a message, showing power and leaving nothing for enemies. Contemporary chroniclers, often victims themselves, recorded horrors of torture and mutilation done for information or just cruelty. Violence was deeply woven into family and community life. Without a central government, protection and justice depended entirely on the clan, so conflicts could quickly turn brutally violent. Disputes over land, livestock, or honor could escalate fast, from heated words to fistfights, then to knife or axe wounds. Domestic violence wasn't considered a crime. The head of the household had wide authority over those under him, allowing abuse with no legal consequences. As mentioned, blood feuds, vendettas, meant that murder or serious assault against a clan member could spark violent retaliation between families, setting off endless cycles of killing and revenge. The sagas are full of outlaws forced into exile for killings in such disputes, while the victims' relatives hunted down their enemies. What really sets Viking violence apart from modern violence is how accepted and normalized brutality was. For Vikings, violence wasn't shameful if done with honor. It was a tool, a way of life, an unavoidable reality. Growing up surrounded by fights, bloodshed, and the ever-present threat of death forged a toughness that today might seem inhuman. Psychological trauma from constant violence wasn't recognized. It was just normal. Empathy, as we understand it, was a luxury rarely extended to outsiders or enemies. For a modern person, sensitive to violence and used to institutions stepping in to handle conflicts, living in a world where brutality was everywhere, every neighbor could be a threat, and survival depended on fighting skill or clan strength, would be an unbearable shock. No, in that world, your modern mind and body wouldn't last a day. One especially disturbing part of this harsh reality was slavery. Cereal, plural cerealer. Far from marginal, slavery was a fundamental part of the economy and society. The existence of the cerealer shows just how different their values and views on humanity were. Slaves did most of the labor. There was no large class of paid workers. Heavy work on farms, plowing, planting, harvesting, tending animals, cleaning stables, fell to the cerealer. They also built houses, chopped wood, mined iron, and did household chores. A clan's or person's wealth wasn't just measured in land, silver, or livestock, but by how many slaves they owned. More slaves meant more productivity and higher status. Most slaves came from raids and sackings. Captives taken from England, Ireland, and Slavic villages were chained and brought back home. But slavery could also result from debt bondage or punishment. A free man who couldn't pay his debts or was convicted of a crime could be sold. Slave children were born into slavery, keeping the system going. Treatment was brutal. Slaves were property, not people with no rights. Their lives were entirely at their master's mercy. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or killed with no legal consequences. They couldn't own property, marry free people without permission, or testify at the thing. Physical and sexual abuse went unchecked. Some masters might show kindness to valuable slaves, but any mercy depended solely on the master's choice, never the slave's right. Picture a cereal working in a frozen field, dressed in rags and starving. If he complained or refused work, his master could beat, starve, or kill him. No one could step in. No law protected him. His life was endless labor, fear, and humiliation. Some slaves hoped for manumission, freedom, a rare chance that depended on the master's goodwill and often required years of exceptional service, plus a payment. The moral reality of Viking slavery is utterly foreign to modern conscience. For us, slavery is a horrific violation of human rights. For Vikings, it was an accepted, necessary foundation of social and economic life. They saw no moral conflict in owning other humans, especially foreign war captives. This moral divide from our sense of human dignity is perhaps the biggest shock when trying to understand their world. Our sense of outrage and social justice would be deeply shaken by how widespread slavery was, the lack of protection for victims, and the systematic dehumanization it involved.